The scalpel gleamed under the bright surgical lights as Dr. Daniel Carter made a precise incision. A routine operation, nothing complicated, until the storm hit. Outside, thunder rumbled, shaking the windows of St. Mercy Hospital. Rain pounded against the glass, wind howling like a beast trying to break in. Daniel ignored it. Focus was everything. "Doctor, the storm is getting worse," a nurse murmured. Daniel nodded but didn't look up. His patient, James Holloway, a 36-year-old father of two, was unconscious on the table. He just needed a stent placed in his artery, a standard low-risk procedure. The first flicker of the lights barely fazed him. The second flicker made his pulse spike. Then darkness. A deafening crack of thunder ripped through the hospital, followed by the sudden hum of backup generators kicking in. "Keep the light steady," Daniel instructed, his voice calm. A nurse used her phone's flashlight, illuminating the surgical site. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. Then another blackout. The backup generator failed. A distant crash sounded outside. The storm had knocked down a tree, crushing the hospital's power supply. Panic rippled through the OR. Monitors flatlined. Machines shut down. Daniel's hand twitched. His scalpel slipped. The wrong incision. The nurse gasped. Blood spurted. Too much. Too fast. "Damn it," Daniel muttered. He reached for the clamps, for anything to stop the arterial bleed. Blood pressure dropping. Another voice shouted, "I need more light." Daniel barked, his heart hammering. But seconds felt like eternity in the darkness. And then a flat line, a horrifying, endless tone. Daniel froze. "No, no, no." The room spun. He tried everything, fought for every second, but deep down he knew James Holloway was gone. The moment the lights flickered back on, Daniel saw his own hands, drenched in blood that shouldn't have been spilled. The fatal mistake was his. The courtroom was packed. The Holloway family sat in the front row, eyes burning with grief and rage. The jury listened to expert testimonies, power failure reports, backup generator failures, all proving Daniel wasn't at fault. The verdict? Not guilty. But public opinion didn't care. Newspapers screamed. Police Carlight, the butcher of St. Mercy. Police Carlight, doctor's deadly mistake costs father of two his life. Then came the final betrayal. His wife, Emily Carter, came home late one night. Her guilty expression said everything. "I'm leaving you," she whispered. Daniel clenched his fists. "Because I lost my career?" "Because I found someone else," Emily admitted. His heart shattered. Emily had been cheating with Elliot Grayson, the wealthy hospital board member who had sealed Daniel's fate, ensuring he'd never practice medicine again. By morning, Daniel Carter was a ruined man. And by the end of the week, he was gone. Snowflakes swirled in the cold evening air, settling gently on the empty streets. Inside a small bookstore on the corner of Maple Avenue, Daniel Carter turned the page of a book he wasn't really reading. It had been 2 years since he walked away from medicine, 2 years since his life crumbled into dust. Now, he lived in the quiet, hidden between shelves of forgotten stories, avoiding the world that once revered him. The world, however, had other plans. A loud crash shattered the silence. The windows trembled from the impact, a violent screech of metal against metal piercing through the quiet town. Daniel's pulse jumped. He tossed the book aside and rushed outside. His breath fogged in the freezing air as he spotted the wreck, a sedan, crushed against the back of a pickup truck. Steam hissed from the mangled hood. The driver's side was completely caved in. A small crowd had gathered, watching, whispering, but no one moved to help. Daniel's instincts took over. He ran to the wreck, peering inside. The front seat passengers, a man and woman, were barely conscious, blood trickling from their foreheads. But it was the back seat that sent a chill through his bones. A little girl, no older than 8, lay slumped over, her tiny frame still, her lips unervingly blue. Daniel yanked at the handle, but the door was jammed. He grabbed a metal rod lying on the icy ground and slammed it against the glass. It shattered, cutting his knuckles, but he barely felt it. His hands reached inside, pressing 2 fingers to the girl's neck. No pulse. His vision blurred. the past crashing over him like a tidal wave. James Holloway on the operating table. Blood spilling from the wrong incision. The flatline. His own hands drenched in failure. Not again. Daniel shoved the debris aside and pulled the girl out, cradling her in his arms as he fell to his knees in the snow. She was so light. Too light. He tilted her head back, sealing his mouth over hers, breathing life into lifeless lungs. 1, 2, 3. He pressed against her chest, counting under his breath, his heart pounding with every compression. Come back. Come back. The girl gasped, her small body jerking as she sucked in air. Relief slammed into him like a freight train. Sirens wailed in the distance, flashing red and blue cutting through the snowfall. Paramedics rushed in, lifting the girl onto a stretcher. She stopped breathing, Daniel told them, voice hoarse. She's stable now, but she needs oxygen fast. A paramedic, a young woman, glanced at him curiously. Are you a doctor? Daniel hesitated. The title no longer belonged to him. I used to be, he murmured. Before he could turn away, he felt it. A pair of eyes burning into him. The girl's mother stood nearby, clutching her injured arm, her gaze locked onto Daniel. Not with gratitude, with recognition. Loudspeaker, before we continue, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The bell above the door chimed, breaking the usual stillness of the bookstore. Daniel barely looked up from the book he had been pretending to read, expecting another passing customer. But the presence that entered wasn't aimless or distracted. Carried purpose. A tall, well-dressed man in a charcoal gray coat stepped inside, his polished shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp. Daniel recognized power when he saw it. Daniel Carter? The man asked, his voice smooth yet firm. Daniel closed the book and studied the stranger. Depends on who's asking. The man took a slow step forward, pulling off his leather gloves one finger at a time. Richard Bennett. The name didn't ring a bell. Richard set his gloves on the counter, his piercing gaze never leaving Daniel. You saved my granddaughter's life a few days ago. The bookstore suddenly felt colder. Daniel sat back, keeping his expression neutral. The little girl from the accident? Richard gave a small nod. Her name is Lily. Daniel exhaled, tension easing slightly. How is she? Recovering well. Thanks to you. A pause. That was good of you. Daniel frowned. There was something off about the way Richard said it. Not grateful. Calculating. Wasn't a choice, Daniel said simply. She needed help. Richard picked up a book from the counter, flipping through its pages without interest. Funny thing about fate, he mused. It always finds a way to bring people back together. Daniel tensed. Richard set the book down and finally looked him in the eyes. Tell me, Daniel, do you believe in coincidences? The air shifted. Daniel didn't answer. Richard tilted his head, studying him like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. A former surgeon, now a bookstore owner. At the exact place my granddaughter's accident happens. A remarkable stroke of fate, wouldn't you say? A slow chill ran down Daniel's spine. The way Richard said accident felt wrong. You think it wasn't? Daniel asked carefully. Richard didn't blink. I think the world has a strange way of correcting past mistakes. Daniel's stomach twisted. What past mistakes? Richard leaned in just enough for Daniel to catch the hint of amusement in his voice. You already know. The weight of the moment settled between them. Daniel clenched his fists under the counter. What do you really want, Bennett? Richard's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. I just wanted to meet the man my daughter used to love. Daniel's heart stopped. Julia, Lily's mother, the woman from his past. His breath caught in his throat as realization hit him like a sledgehammer. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Daniel's fingers hovered over the book on the counter, but he wasn't seeing the pages anymore. Julia. The name burned through his mind like a brand he had long tried to erase. Richard Bennett watched him, his expression unreadable, but Daniel knew a predator when he saw one. This wasn't a casual visit. It was a warning. You didn't know Lily was Julia's daughter, did you? Richard asked, his voice smooth, deliberate. Daniel exhaled slowly. No. Richard nodded, as if confirming something to himself. That's interesting. Daniel clenched his jaw. What do you want from me? Richard's lips curled in a ghost of a smile. Nothing. Yet, he turned toward the door but paused before stepping out. I imagine Julia will want to see you soon. His eyes darkened. Let's hope. For your sake, that's a good thing. And then he was gone. But the past had already forced its way in. Years ago, Julia Bennett had always moved like fire. Wild, unpredictable, and impossible to hold without getting burned. She had walked into his or years ago, just another wealthy donor's wife bringing flowers to the sick children's ward, pretending to care. But Daniel had seen something behind her carefully polished smile. Something broken, desperate, trapped. And it wasn't long before they stopped pretending. Their first touch had been electric, a stolen moment in an empty hospital corridor. Their first kiss had been a declaration, a secret rebellion against the life she was forced to live. Julia's husband, Marcus Holloway, was a powerful, ruthless man, a politician with deep connections and an even deeper cruelty. He had built his empire on control, and Julia had been just another possession. But with Daniel, she had been free. They had whispered plans in the dark, to leave, to disappear together. I don't care about the money, she had told him. I just want to breathe again. And Daniel had believed her, until everything fell apart. The night of the surgery that ruined his life, Julia had promised to meet him. They were supposed to run away, to leave everything behind. But she never showed up. She vanished. And Daniel had been left alone in the ruins of his life. The memory felt like a fresh wound as Daniel ran a hand over his face, trying to ground himself. Julia was back. She had a daughter, and Marcus Holloway was still out there. A man like Marcus didn't forgive betrayal. If Julia had come back into his life, it wasn't just fate. It was a storm brewing, and Daniel had nowhere to run. The first sign came the next morning. Daniel unlocked the door to his bookstore and immediately felt something was wrong. The moment he stepped inside, a chill ran through his spine. The shelves had been overturned. Books scattered everywhere. Pages torn, covers ripped. His sanctuary had been violated. Then he saw it. Scrawled across the wall in bold, jagged letters, "You should have stayed dead." His pulse pounded. His first instinct was to grab a weapon, not out of fear but out of instinct. Someone had been here. Someone had wanted him to see this. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He turned toward the door, his gut screaming that someone was watching him. Across the street, a black car idled, its windows tinted. Daniel locked eyes with his reflection in the glass. But he wasn't alone. A shadowed figure sat in the passenger seat, watching him. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, the car drove away. Daniel exhaled, tension gripping his chest. This wasn't random. Someone wanted him to know that his past had found him. That night, he found the letter. No return address. Just a simple, elegant envelope placed under his door. He hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single note, typed, "You took something from us. Now it's time for us to take something from you." No name, no signature. But Daniel didn't need one. He knew exactly who had sent it. It was well past midnight when the knock came. He was half expecting it, half dreading it. Daniel pulled open the door, and there she was. Julia. She had changed. Her face was thinner, her eyes darker. But that same fire still flickered beneath the exhaustion. She stepped inside without asking, her breath uneven. "You shouldn't have saved her," she whispered. Daniel frowned. "Excuse me?" Julia's hands trembled. "The accident." "It wasn't an accident." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" he asked carefully. Julia pressed her lips together, eyes darting toward the window, as if someone was watching. They probably were. "They planned it," she admitted. "Richard, Marcus. They set it up to draw you out." Daniel stiffened. "They wanted me to find Lily?" Julia nodded. "They knew you wouldn't ignore it. They knew you'd step in." Her voice cracked. They wanted to see if you still had the instinct to save someone. Daniel felt sick. Everything. The wreck, the girl, the mother's strange stare. None of it had been fate. It was a trap. His fingers curled into fists. Why? Julia swallowed. Because they're not finished with you. She hesitated. And neither am I. A storm brewed behind her eyes. Something between desperation and regret. Daniel, she said softly. They're going to destroy you. Daniel held her gaze, his heartbeat steady. Let them try. The next morning, Daniel barely slept. Every noise outside felt like a warning. Every flicker of shadow outside his window a reminder that he was being watched. By who? Richard? Marcus? Both? The message had been clear. They weren't done with him. Julia had left in a hurry, whispering something about finding a way to fix this. But Daniel knew better. There was no fixing this. He was in it now, and they wanted him to break. The second letter arrived that afternoon. Another crisp envelope, no address, slid under his door while he had his back turned. He ripped it open. You took what was mine. I will take what is yours. Daniel's grip tightened. Marcus. Marcus Holloway, Julia's husband. The man she had tried to escape. The man who had buried Daniel's career. And now he wanted more. The storm inside Daniel's mind barely settled when the next blow hit. The bookstore door slammed open, the bell jingling wildly. Julia. Her coat was soaked from the cold rain outside, but it was the panic in her eyes that made his stomach tighten. They know I came to see you, she whispered. Daniel's pulse spiked. What? She shut the door behind her, shaking, frantic. They're watching me too. Marcus. He's furious. He said you took me from him before. He thinks you're trying to do it again. Daniel clenched his jaw. I haven't seen you in years, Julia. I know. She sucked in a breath. But he doesn't care. Richard doesn't care. They want to make you suffer. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the weight of everything crashing down. They already did, he muttered. 2 years ago. When they ruined me. Julia swallowed hard. Not like this. Daniel met her gaze and suddenly he saw it. The truth. The regret. The fear. You knew, he said quietly. Julia blinked. Daniel, you knew they were setting me up. His voice was steady, but underneath it was a slow-burning rage. That's why you looked at me that way. After I saved Lily, she didn't deny it. Because it was true. She had known. Julia's hands curled into fists. I didn't want this. But you let it happen, Daniel said. And it wasn't a question. Her chin trembled, but she nodded. Silence hung between them, heavy with history, with betrayal, with something unfinished. Then she stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't understand, Daniel, she said. They don't just want to ruin you anymore. They want to kill you. Daniel didn't flinch. If Marcus and Richard wanted war, they had just gotten one. Daniel stood still, his heartbeat steady, even as Julia's words echoed in his ears. They don't just want to ruin you anymore. They want to kill you. It should have scared him. But after 2 years of exile, 2 years of being hunted like a ghost, something inside him snapped back into place. A part of him that hadn't died with his career. A part of him that refused to run. He exhaled slowly, his eyes locked on Julia. Then let's not make it easy for them. Her breath hitched. Daniel, I need to know everything. His voice was sharp, cutting through the fear thickening the air. No more lies. She hesitated, then finally spilled the truth. Richard had orchestrated the accident, but Marcus had been the mastermind. He knew you'd save Lily, Julia said, voice shaking. He wanted to see if you were still capable of it. If your instincts were still there. Daniel's stomach twisted. Why? Her lips pressed together. Because he's planning something bigger. And he wanted to know if you'd be a problem. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Problem. Which meant Marcus was doing more than just seeking revenge. He was hiding something. And now Daniel was too close to the truth. That night Daniel didn't sleep. He combed through every piece of the past. His trial, his downfall, the way his career had been obliterated in a matter of days. And suddenly it all made sense. The power outage that led to his surgical mistake. The generator failure that should have had backups. The board's immediate push to strip him of his license. It had never been about a mistake. It had been a setup. And now Marcus wanted to erase any evidence of what he had done. Which meant Daniel wasn't the only target. His chest tightened. Julia. Her eyes darted up. If Marcus is trying to silence me, he'll do the same to you. She swallowed hard. I know. Daniel's mind raced. He had spent 2 years running, hiding. But this wasn't just his fight anymore. It never had been. I need to see Richard. Julia's eyes widened. Daniel. He knows things, Daniel said. Things he didn't mean to say. And I think he's starting to regret it. Julia shook her head. He'll never betray Marcus. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then I'll give him a reason to. This wasn't about saving himself anymore. This was about exposing the truth. And for the first time in 2 years, Daniel Carter wasn't going to run. He was going to fight. Daniel moved like a man who had already made peace with his fate. There was no more hesitation, no more fear. He had spent 2 years hiding, but now it was time to make them regret coming after him. Julia sat at his kitchen table, gripping a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Her hands trembled, her eyes flickering with a storm of emotions. Guilt, fear, and something else, something unfinished. You really think you can make Richard turn on Marcus? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's eyes were cold. I know I can. She exhaled shakily, setting the cup down. How? Daniel leaned forward, voice steady. Because Richard is afraid of him too. Julia looked at him, confused. Daniel continued, piecing it together as he spoke. Richard was too calculated when he visited me. He was testing me, trying to figure out how much I knew. And Daniel smirked, though there was no humor in it. Which means he's already thinking about switching sides. Julia paled. That's dangerous. It's also our only chance, Daniel said. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through the list of contacts he had long ignored. He found what he needed. An old number, one he hadn't called in years. A journalist. A good one. Wait, Julia said, standing up suddenly. Daniel, if you push this, if you back Richard into a corner, Marcus will know. And when he knows, he'll come for me. Daniel met her gaze, his voice low and final. That's the point. The rooftop restaurant was nearly empty. The snowfall turning the city into a silent graveyard. Richard Bennett sat alone at a private table, sipping whiskey, his usual arrogance dimmed by unease. Daniel approached without hesitation, pulling out the chair across from him. Richard exhaled sharply. I didn't invite you. Daniel smirked. Then why did you show up? Richard glanced around, making sure they weren't being watched, as if he already knew this was dangerous. Marcus won't let you live, Richard finally said, voice low. You know that, don't you? Daniel leaned forward. I think you're starting to realize he won't let you live either. Richard's fingers tightened around his glass. There it was. The hesitation. Daniel pushed harder. You think you're safe because you're his ally? He tilted his head. You helped him take me down. You covered for him. Lied for him. His voice sharpened. Do you think a man like Marcus lets liabilities walk away? Richard didn't answer, because he knew the truth. And that was all Daniel needed. I have proof, Daniel said. Richard's eyes snapped to his. That's impossible. Daniel leaned back, letting the silence do the work. Then he dropped the bomb. You think I haven't been digging for the last 2 years? Daniel let a smirk tug at his lips. You think I haven't found every single thing that connects Marcus to my downfall? Richard's jaw tightened. Daniel leaned in, voice sharp as a blade. You help me bring him down, or we both go down with him. Richard's face darkened with realization. He had just walked into Daniel's trap. Richard stared at Daniel across the table, his grip on the whiskey glass tightening. He was trapped, and he knew it. You're playing a dangerous game, Richard murmured. Daniel leaned back. I don't play games, Richard. I end them. A long silence stretched between them. Then, with a slow exhale, Richard nodded. All right, I'll help. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't trust him. Back at his bookstore, Julia paced anxiously, her arms wrapped around herself. Richard agreed? She asked. Daniel nodded. But I don't trust him. You shouldn't, she whispered. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Julia hesitated, her fingers tightening around her sleeve. Marcus knows, Daniel. A chill ran through him. She swallowed hard. I overheard a call. He knows you're coming for him. And he's planning something. Daniel's pulse quickened. Of course he knows. We have to move fast, he said. Julia looked at him, eyes full of fear. And what if we're too late? Daniel's jaw tightened. Then I die trying. The next morning, Daniel sent everything he had to the journalist. The files, the evidence, every single thread that tied Marcus to corruption, to his downfall. He knew once it went public, Marcus would have no choice but to act. And that's exactly what Daniel wanted. But the betrayal came faster than he expected. That night, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Who is this? A voice filled the line. Cold, amused, deadly. I told you, Daniel. You should have stayed buried. Daniel's blood ran cold. You wanted me to come for you? Fine. But first, I'll take something from you. His stomach dropped. A muffled scream came through the line. Julia. The line went dead. Daniel's heart stopped. Marcus had taken her. Daniel arrived at the abandoned warehouse on the docks. His mind a razor's edge of fury and focus. Marcus was waiting for him. Julia was tied to a chair in the center of the room. A bruise on her cheek, her wrists raw from struggling. Marcus stood behind her, a knife tracing her throat. Richard was there too, silent, watching. Daniel's hands curled into fists. Let her go. Marcus chuckled. After everything? I don't think so. He tilted his head. You ruined my life, Daniel. Took what was mine. Daniel stepped forward. She was never yours. Marcus's face darkened. He pulled a gun, aiming it at Daniel's chest. You think this ends with an article in the newspaper? Marcus sneered. You think you get to win? Daniel didn't flinch. Behind Marcus, Richard shifted. The hesitation was brief, but Daniel saw it. Richard, Marcus barked. Kill him. Richard didn't move. A beat. Then gunfire. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Daniel didn't move. Marcus staggered. His face twisted in confusion as he looked down. A red bloom spread across his shirt. His own gun fell from his hands and clattered to the floor. Richard had shot him. For a split second, no one moved. Marcus stumbled, one hand clutching his chest, rage and betrayal twisting his face. He turned his glare on Richard, his voice hoarse. You? Another gunshot. This time, Richard didn't hesitate. One to the head. Marcus Holloway collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel exhaled slowly, his pulse still hammering in his ears. Richard stood frozen, the gun still gripped in his shaking hands. You didn't give me a choice, Richard muttered, his voice hollow. Daniel didn't answer. He moved toward Julia, untying the ropes that had cut into her wrists. She fell against him, her breath shuddering, her body trembling from fear and adrenaline. Are you okay? He whispered. She nodded weakly, but her grip on him tightened. Daniel helped her stand, keeping an eye on Richard. You didn't do that for me, Daniel said finally. Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. No. He turned his gaze to Marcus's lifeless body. I did it for myself. A long silence. Then Richard sighed. I need to disappear. Daniel nodded. I think that would be best. Richard gave him one last unreadable look, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The news broke the next morning. Marcus Holloway was dead. His corruption was exposed. His business, his influence, all gone. Julia sat at Daniel's kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee with hands that still shook. It's over, she murmured. Daniel watched her. Was it? He had spent so long running, fighting, surviving. And now, standing in the ruins of Marcus's empire, he realized something. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't seeking revenge. He just wanted to live. You don't have to leave, Julia said suddenly. We could. Daniel shook his head. We both know that's not true. She looked away, biting her lip. He reached across the table, gently touching her hand. You have a daughter who needs you, Julia. Go be with her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Where will you go? She whispered. Daniel exhaled. Somewhere quiet. She smiled softly, the way she used to before everything fell apart. I hope you find peace, Daniel. For the first time in years, he believed he might. 1 week later, Daniel stood at a train station, a single bag over his shoulder, a ticket to anywhere in his pocket. Then his phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. You think it's over? It's never over, Dr. Carter. Daniel stared at the screen. Then slowly he smiled. Let them try,